There's a man, mid-30s, let's say. He has done everything right. He built the career, he earned the respect, he learned somewhere along the way how to look like someone who has it together. And for the most part, in most rooms, he does, until the room contains a boss, or a mentor, or a judge, a panel, an authority of any kind, anyone who holds formal power over an outcome that matters to him. And then something happens that he cannot explain and cannot stop. Sometimes he goes completely quiet, deferential in a way that embarrasses him later, agreeing to things he knows are wrong, nodding when he should be pushing back, watching himself disappear in real time. And sometimes, without warning, without a clear enough reason, he erupts. He says the thing that ends the relationship. He walks out. He torches the opportunity. He cannot predict which version will show up. Neither can anyone around him. And the worst part is that he is not, by any measure, a weak man. He knows this about himself. That is what makes it so confusing. That is what makes it feel less like a flaw and more like something installed. Because that is closer to the truth. Something was installed. Or more precisely, something wasn't. Not every absent father left the house. Some of them were present every single evening. They sat at the dinner table. They paid the bills. They showed up to the games. But they never arrived in the way that actually mattered. They were there in body and absent in authority. Not cruel authority. Not the authority of punishment, but the authority of structure. The kind of presence that teaches a child, wordlessly, over years, that there is a shape to things, that limits exist for a reason, that the world outside the home has a logic, and here is how you move through it, that you, specifically, have what it takes to stand inside that world without collapsing or exploding. When that goes missing, the inner world, everything happening inside a person, whether they can see it or not, does not simply lack something the way a shelf lacks a book. It becomes ungoverned. The child grows up with weather on the inside and no architecture to hold it. Every strong feeling moves through an open field. There are no walls, no channels, nothing to give the storm a shape it can survive. The father's role in the inner world was never primarily warmth. That is different territory, and it matters enormously, but it belongs somewhere else. What the father carries is law, direction, the axis between the home and the horizon. It is the force that says, there is an outside, and you are capable of meeting it. When that force is absent, when the container was never built, or was built badly, or kept collapsing, what grows in its place is not freedom. What grows is a bruise with its own nervous system. That bruise, what we can call a complex, does not wait for you to decide how to respond. It fires first. The moment something in the room rhymes with the original absence, it runs its own script. It has been running that script since before the man in our story was old enough to name what was missing. This is not an episode about blaming fathers. Many of the fathers who failed to build this container were themselves carrying the same wound, handed down from their own fathers, who received it from theirs. The failure moves through families like weather moves through an open field. This is about something else. This is about mapping, carefully, honestly, what actually happens inside a person when that particular structure was never built. What it does to confidence, what it does to ambition, what it does to every room that contains someone who holds power. Because before you can build something, you have to understand what is actually missing. And the question worth sitting with, before any explanation, before any framework, is this: what exactly was the father supposed to provide that no one else could? The father was supposed to provide something that cannot be improvised. Not affection. Affection can come from many directions. Not even safety, which a mother can offer with equal force. What the father was supposed to provide was initiation into the outer world, the crossing of the threshold, the transmission of a specific intelligence. This is how power works. This is how you hold yourself when you enter a room that could judge you. This is what it feels like to move through authority rather than be crushed by it. That intelligence is what we mean when we say the Father carried law. Not rules, not punishment. Law in the older sense. The principle that orients you, that tells you which way is forward. Behind every human father, behind even the most ordinary man who sat in an ordinary house and failed quietly and without fanfare, stands something much larger than he was. An archetype, a pattern so old it predates any individual family, any culture, any civilization. It belongs to the entire human lineage. Think of it this way. A bird does not learn to migrate. The knowledge is already in its bones. It was placed there by every generation of birds that crossed that route before it and survived. Something similar is true of human beings. We are not born as blank pages. We are born already carrying the shapes of certain ancient roles: mother, child, hero, elder, and father. The father archetype belongs to what we can call the collective unconscious, not the personal storehouse of your memories, not anything assembled from your own experience, but the species inherited layer, the place where these ancient patterns live, belonging to no one person and therefore available to everyone. The real father's job was never to be the archetype. His job was to carry it, to be a human vessel for something far older than him, and to pass it inward, into his child, through nothing more mysterious than presence. When he could not do that, when he was absent, or hollow, or carrying a wound too large to work around, the child still came into the world carrying the template. The need for the father archetype does not disappear because the outer father failed to show up. That is the part that makes the wound so strange, so different from an ordinary disappointment. The child doesn't just miss the man. Something older than the child, something built into the architecture of being human, goes hunting for what it was supposed to receive. What governs adult life, then, is not the real father. It is the inner picture the child's inner world constructed of him. And this picture is built from two things that don't add up to anything simple. Part of it comes from actual experience. The silences, the absences, the moments of warmth and collapse and failure. But part of it comes from the archetype itself, which charges the image with power that no human being actually possesses. This is why a man who is genuinely competent, genuinely accomplished, can walk into a room containing a single authority figure and feel something shift at the base of his spine. It is not the person in front of him. It is what that person has activated in the inner picture. The inner world mistakes the boss for the archetype. The mentor becomes charged with the power of something ancient. The father complex, the constellation of feelings and invisible rules and half-formed images organized around everything the missing father left behind, works like a gravitational field whose source has disappeared but whose pull keeps bending every subsequent orbit. There is a story about a boy who grew up attending confirmation classes taught by his own father, a decent man, an honest man, a pastor. The boy made his way through the catechism with mounting boredom until one day he turned the pages and found a section on the Trinity, and something in him woke up. He waited for weeks for the lesson to arrive. When it finally did, his father looked at the page and said, "We'll skip this bit. I can't make head or tail of it myself." And that was it. No cruelty, no rage. An honest admission from a decent man who simply did not possess what the moment required. And still, the inheritance was emptiness. Spiritual poverty passed from one generation to the next, not as a decision, but as a fact of what was never owned. The son could not be given what the father did not have. This is the principle that runs beneath every father wound. Nothing exerts a stronger pull on the inner world of a child than the life unlived by the parent. A father who buried his ambitions, who swallowed his grief, who suppressed the rebellion he could not afford, passes those unexploded charges forward without intending to. The child does not receive a story they can read and respond to. They receive a pressure, a temperature, an urgency that seems to rise from inside them, but was never actually theirs to begin with. There was a physician in the 16th century who spent his life overturning every established institution he touched: academies, guilds, medical traditions, the authority of ancient texts. He burned the books. He fought with everyone. He could not stop. His father was an illegitimate son of a nobleman, exiled to a Swiss valley, practicing medicine in obscurity, holding inside himself an unconfessed longing for a world he had forfeited before his son was born. The son's great love, his only real tenderness, was for this wounded, buried man. And so the son spent his entire life doing what the father could not, winning back the fame, assaulting every authority that stood in for the one that had diminished his only friend. He was not living his life. He was completing his father's unfinished sentence. That is the father complex in motion. What the father could not achieve, the son is driven to pursue, but driven by an inheritance he cannot see, toward a finish line that keeps moving, for a victory that never quite lands as victory, because the person who was supposed to receive it has been dead for years. There is a function that the father was supposed to carry inward over time, not through speeches, not through lessons, but through the accumulated pressure of being present and oriented and capable of meeting the world. We can call it the wise old man, not the person, but the function, direction, meaning, the internal compass that orients you when you are lost. When the outer father cannot carry this, when he is absent or broken or himself lost, the inner world does not give up on finding it. It spends decades searching for it in every external authority it can locate: a teacher, a boss, a therapist, a spiritual leader, anyone who seems to know which way is forward. The search is not irrational. It is, in its own way, faithful. But it is a search conducted with a hunger that no external authority was built to satisfy. And here is where the wound begins to divide. Because when the inner world cannot find what it is looking for, it does not stand still. It adapts. Some people pour every drop of energy they have into earning the approval of power. They overperform. They cannot stop. They will work until the authority nods, and even then it is not enough, because the authority they are performing for does not exist outside them. And others, carrying the same original wound, the same hollow where the structure was supposed to be, do something that looks like the opposite. They destroy every structure they enter. They fight every limit. They cannot accept authority because every authority stands in for the one that was supposed to provide something and didn't. The wound is the same. The shapes it takes are entirely different. Consider the overperformer first. He is not simply ambitious. Ambition, in the ordinary sense, knows what it wants. The overperformer does not know what he wants. He only knows what he cannot afford to stop doing. Every achievement is adequate for about 48 hours. Then the drive resets. The approval he collected last week means nothing this week. He cannot hear "good enough" as a complete sentence, because the sentence was never supposed to end there. He is paying a debt to someone who never asked him to pay it, using a currency that person will never collect. The physician from the 16th century, the one who burned the books, fought the guilds, drove out of every city he entered after making enemies of everyone who had offered him a platform, was paying exactly this debt. His father's life had been quietly catastrophic. Born to the wrong side of an aristocratic line, carrying a name that belonged to a world he had been expelled from, practicing medicine in a forgotten valley. He received pilgrims passing through on their way to somewhere more important, and he smiled and sent them on, and pressed back down into himself the life he had been robbed of before his son was born. Nothing exerts a stronger pull on the inner world of the next generation than the life unlived by the parent. The son absorbed that pressure, not as an instruction, not as a choice, but as a temperature, as a constant urgency that felt like his own ambition because it arose inside his own body, but was never entirely his. He loved his father. That love was the transmission. And so he spent his entire life doing what his father could not, attacking every authority that stood in for the one that had diminished his only friend, winning back the fame that had been taken before he was born. He was not living his life. He was completing a sentence his father had been forced to leave unfinished. This is what inflation looks like when it operates through love rather than grandiosity. The ego reaches into the inherited storehouse and puts on a costume too large for it, not out of arrogance, but out of loyalty. The rebel son performs his father's unlived vengeance. The ambition he thinks is his own belongs, at its root, to someone else's grief. Now consider pattern B, the one who looks like the overperformer's opposite, but shares the same origin. This is the person who cannot stay. Every mentorship that ripens toward genuine support gets destroyed before the support can arrive. Every institution that tries to contain them becomes an enemy. Every boss becomes a test they set up to fail. Not because they are weak, because every structure unconsciously stands in for the one that was supposed to provide limits that felt like love and didn't. And so the move they make, the preemptive destruction, the walkout before the disappointment lands, is not chaos. It is a strategy. It is the wound's way of burning the building down before it can burn you. You cannot be abandoned if you leave first. You cannot be failed if you are already gone. The man who opened his life story with the words, "My father was a very big and strong man." The man with the nervous stomach and the thoughts of suicide and the 34 years of depression. That man had not left his father. He had spent his entire adult life in motion around a single gravitational center, trying to find someone large enough and strong enough to finally settle the question that the original father had left open. And when the candidates appeared, a boss, an older woman, an institution, he could not let them be human. He needed them to be the answer. And when they revealed their ordinary limitations, as every human being must, the collapse was not just disappointment. It was confirmation of the original verdict, not worth staying for. Overperformer and rebel are not opposites. They are twins. Both are still, in their deepest logic, organized around the same absent center. Both are conducting the same conversation, with different words in different rooms, using different tools, with an empty chair. The achievement is addressed to it. The destruction is addressed to it. Even the soul image, the invisible template that shapes who feels magnetic and who feels dangerous, gets built around it. For those with a father wound, the people who feel most compelling are often the ones whose unavailability rhymes with the original absence. The boss who is brilliant but cold. The mentor who is generous until suddenly he is not. The relationship that promises the structure and withholds it at the crucial moment. It does not feel like a wound selecting its own repetition. It feels like fate. And beneath all of this, beneath the behavioral patterns, beneath the career wreckage and the destroyed mentorships and the achievements that never land as enough, there is something the wound is actually about. Something older than the behavioral layer. The father archetype, when it functions through a real person, is the first carrier of what will eventually become an adult's inner sense of orientation toward meaning. Not warmth, not safety. The function that says, there is a direction, and you can find it, and it will be yours. The wise old man in the dream who passes judgment. The voice of authority that issues from somewhere beyond the merely personal. The capacity to say, this, not that, with genuine conviction rather than borrowed certainty. When the outer father cannot carry this function, when he is absent, or broken, or himself lost, the inner world does not stop needing it. It goes hunting for it in every external container it can find. An institution, an ideology, a figure who seems to possess the direction the person was never given. And each time that external container fails, as all external containers of the paternal function eventually must, the collapse is not just ordinary loss. It is catastrophic. because what collapsed was not a person. It was a proxy for something the person has been searching for since before they could name the search. The wound, in the end, is not psychological. It is spiritual. The father was supposed to be the first bridge to something larger than the family, larger than the personal. When that bridge was never built, people spend decades building it out of whoever is willing to stand still long enough. And they keep being surprised when those people turn out to be human. So what do you do with this? Not as a general question, but specifically, when you can see the pattern in yourself, when you recognize the overperforming or the preemptive destruction, when you understand that the search for an external carrier of the paternal function is organized around something that no external authority was built to satisfy. What then? The first move is a distinction that sounds simple and is not. The father you carry inside you is not the man who lived in your house. He is a composite, part real memory, distorted by a child's perception of a power that seemed absolute, part the archetypal charge that was loaded onto him before you were old enough to form a single coherent thought about who he was, and part what you needed him to be, the container that was supposed to hold law and direction, and the message that you were capable of meeting the world, that he could not provide. These layers are not identical. The man was limited. The inner picture is enormous because it carries forces that exceed any single human being. You have been fighting or chasing the enormous picture. The limited man has often been buried under it, invisible. The work does not begin with forgiving him, necessarily. It begins with learning to see the difference. What belongs to him? What belongs to the archetype? What was yours to begin with, charged up by the wound and mistaken for inheritance? That distinction will not arrive cleanly. It takes years, and it happens in pieces. But it is the precondition for everything else. The second move is recognizing the pattern's cost, not what it produces, but what it prevents. The overperformer produces achievement, but the person running the pattern cannot rest, cannot receive what the achievement brings, cannot hear approval as genuine, because the one whose approval would have mattered is not in the room and never will be again. The rebel produces independence, but the person inside that pattern cannot stay, cannot accept support long enough for it to become real, cannot let anything ripen, because ripening requires waiting inside a structure you trust, and trust of that kind never developed. Here the concept of transference becomes visible in daily life. Every mentorship, every employer, every institution you have placed your hope in, some portion of that hope was addressed not to the actual person or organization in front of you, but to the father standing trial behind them. The unconscious courtroom where every authority gets charged with the original crime. When you see this happening, when you notice that the fury or the disappointment is too large for the person in front of you, that you are performing for a verdict no one in that room has the power to deliver, that noticing is itself a kind of freedom. Not resolution, not healing, but the first crack of light in a room that was sealed shut. The third move is the one the 16th century physician never made. His father's unlived life ran through him as pure drive, unrecognized, unclaimed, aimed at a goal that could never be fully reached because it was never fully his. The principle that wounded him can be reversed. What a father could not finish, he gave to you as raw material, not as a sentence. You are not required to complete it. You can hold the inheritance, the hunger, the rage, the consuming drive towards something that keeps moving, and look at it clearly enough to ask, which part of this is mine? What would I choose if I were choosing from my own center rather than from the wounds? That is not a question that gets answered in a day, but it is the question the long work of becoming your own person requires you to keep asking. And then there is the hardest and most unglamorous part. When the outer father failed to install the structure eventually has to come from inside, not from another authority, not from the next mentor who seems promising, the next institution that feels certain, the next framework that appears to offer what the original container couldn't. From inside. This is what every initiation rite in every human culture was attempting to accomplish, not just the separation from the parents, but the installation in the young person of an inner law that could survive the absence of any single human carrier, a capacity to say no to yourself with dignity, to hold your own limits without rage and without collapse, to govern from within rather than borrowing the structure from whoever is willing to stand in the father's spot this season. The man who moved into his father's room after the death, who took on the responsibilities, who felt grief and a terrible new freedom arrive in the same week, was beginning this work before he was remotely ready for it. The weight was too large, the readiness was partial, but he had to step into the role before he had earned it, because the person who was supposed to hold it first had died before completing the handoff. That is often how it works. Not a clean transition, not a ceremony, a stumbling forward into a version of yourself that did not exist yet. The organizing center that keeps pressing toward wholeness, call it the self, the intelligence inside the personality that has been running the deeper story all along, does not stop operating because the outer father failed. It presses forward, through the overperforming, through the distraction, through the long passage of disorientation when the borrowed structures finally collapse and there is nothing to lean on. That passage, the night sea journey, the descent that looks like failure from the outside, but is the inner world dismantling what was never genuinely yours, is not a punishment. It is, in its own way, a preparation. What it prepares you for is the authority you build after losing all your borrowed versions of it. And that is the only kind that is fully yours. The man from the beginning of this, the one who shrinks in some rooms and erupts in others, who cannot predict which version will appear when authority walks through the door, is still waiting. That is the honest thing to say about it. He is still waiting for a father who is not coming back in the form he needed. That waiting is not weakness. It is the natural posture of someone who was given a slot and never given the key. But it is exhausting, and it costs years. What the missing father left behind is not a deficit to be mourned indefinitely. It is an inheritance of unfinished energy. The hunger for structure that never arrived, the drive that has no name, the rage that has no clear address. That energy does not disappear because its source was insufficient. It is still there, still moving, still organizing the inner world around an absence. The question is not whether it runs. The question is who runs it. The father, in the end, is not a person. He is a function, a capacity for inner law, orientation, and meaning. Some people receive it through a living man who was present enough and oriented enough to pass it inward, through nothing more dramatic than consistency over years. Some people have to build it themselves, after the detours, after the borrowed structures, after the long work of learning to tell the difference between what was given to them and what is actually theirs. The ones who build it carry something the inherited kind cannot always match, because they know what the absence costs. They know what it takes to govern yourself when no one installed the governing principle for you. And that knowledge, hard-won, specific, paid for with years rather than handed over at birth, is its own form of authority, one that does not depend on any external father to remain standing.